Well, hello and welcome to this Berkeley Center webinar on religion and violence in Papua New Guinea and the Pacific. Good afternoon or evening to those who are joining us in the Western Hemisphere, and good morning on Thursday to those who are joining from Asia and the Pacific region. My name is Judd Birdsall. I serve as a senior fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. And I'm delighted that Georgetown Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies is co-sponsoring today's webinar. Today, we're going to discuss a recent report on religion and conflict in Papua New Guinea, and then look at some broader regional dynamics. And I'm pleased that we have the report's two co-authors with us alongside two additional regional experts. And I'll introduce all of our speakers in just a moment. First, a quick word about what brings us together today. 3 years ago, the religion team at the U.S. Institute of Peace, USIP, developed a new series of reports called the Religion, Peace, and Conflict Country Studies, or RPACs for short, to provide brief, timely, and accessible analysis to diplomats and other sorts of international affairs practitioners. So far, USIP has published 6 of these RPACs. As you may be aware, the Trump administration has sought to shut down the U.S. Institute of Peace this year. Most of the Institute staff has been fired, and there's an ongoing legal case. And so we don't know what the future holds for USIP. More broadly, due to restructuring within the U.S. federal government, the infrastructure related to what's often called strategic religious engagement has largely been lost within the U.S. government. So at the Berkeley Center, we've launched a new project called the Strategic Religious Engagement Hub, or SRE Hub, that aims to support the U.S. government's capacity to analyze and engage religion as it relates to diplomacy and development and defense. And as part of that mission, we're collecting and curating documents that have been generated by U.S. government entities over the past 40 years, and we're looking to extend this RPAC series. So today we're highlighting the RPAC on Papua New Guinea. Last year, one of our panelists, Gordon Peake, and I overlapped at USIP as senior advisors, and we had discussed doing an event on Papua New Guinea and the Pacific, so I'm thrilled that we're finally able to hold that event today. In just a moment, we'll start our conversation. We'll chat among ourselves for about 30 minutes or so, and then we'll open up the floor for Q&A and have engagement with the audience for the remainder of our hour together. So be thinking about questions you'd like to pose to our panelists. You can type your question at any point by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Do be as brief as you can be in framing your question, and let us know if there's a specific panelist that you want to address your question to. This webinar is being recorded, and the video will be posted on the Berkeley Center website and on YouTube within the coming days. Well, I'll introduce our panelists now. So the co-authors of the Papua New Guinea report are William Kipongi and Jim Della-Giacoma. William Kipongi is a research officer at the National Research Institute in Papua New Guinea. He has extensive experience dealing with issues related to tribal warfare and peace building in Papua New Guinea, including the specific issue of sorcery accusation-related violence that we'll be discussing today. Jim Della-Giacoma is an independent development consultant who has served in a wide variety of roles, focused mainly on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Our two additional regional experts are Gordon Peake and Miranda Forsyth. Gordon Peake is my former colleague at USIP, and among other qualifications, he served in a variety of capacities focused on the Pacific region, including as an affiliate of Georgetown's Center for Australian, New Zealand, and Pacific Studies. And finally, Miranda Forsyth is professor in the School of Regulation and Global Governance in the College of Asia and Pacific at Australia National University, and she was previously a senior lecturer at the Law School of the University of the South Pacific in Vanuatu. Well, a warm welcome to our panelists, a warm welcome to all of you in the audience joining us from around the world. William, I'd love to start with you. You as the co-author of this excellent report along with Jim. Some of our listeners are going to be very familiar with Papua New Guinea. Some are probably based there. Others, like myself, have limited knowledge of the country and its religious dynamics. I wonder if you could just start by orienting us to the Papua New Guinea context. Tell us a little bit about the religious history and the current religious demographics of the country, some of the things that are covered in the first half of the Papua New Guinea RPAC. William, over to you.
Thank you, Judd. And good morning to all from Papua New Guinea. It's 8 o'clock here in PNG. I'm happy to talk about PNG Christian history alongside with my colleague Jim there and Miranda and Gordon. I'll just quickly give a brief brief background on the Christianity in PNG. PNG is actually the first missionaries from the European countries, France, Netherlands, Germany, Holland, and later after the second, not the second, but the First World War, the American missionaries joined in, and actually they extended into the interior of the mainland of Papua New Guinea. So when we actually look at the work and the influence of Christianity in Papua New Guinea, Papua New Guinea was not really officially Christian declared as a Christian state or as a Christian country, but people generally and widely claim that we are a Christian nation because of the Christian influence. That people in some parts of the country, they see the missionaries as the first contact, even before the colonizers. And they widely provide services like health, education, roads, and also tap into people's social structure, cultural norms, trying to shape them in a way that people live in a very peaceful and harmonious community. And having said that, in the last national census done in 2011, the record indicated that 90%, 96% of the population, of the Christian population it's Christians all throughout Papua New Guinea. And that shows that Christian influence in the country is very strong. And most of our current leaders, especially the MPs and business leaders in the country, are brought up by the missionaries. And one of those prominent missionary is given the name Flying Bishop, is from America, Bishop Leo Hackfeld, because he flew in and out of most of the remote highlands while based in the Momase, in Madang and Wewak. So some of these missionaries were very influential, especially in terms of building the constitution of this country, also in terms of developing, in terms of educating the people, and also providing those basic services like health, roads, and so forth. So that's why now at this very moment, they are talking a lot about how can we really make Papua New Guinea as a Christian state. And that's the debate that is still going on in the parliament, where the Prime Minister, James Miranda, lately announced that PNG should be declared as a Christian nation in the main 5 directive goals and principles, not as a legal law, but as a provision adapted into one of those 5 goals of the Constitution, which actually talks about the PNG ways. So when everyone tried to look at themselves as a Christian, it's really hard for the leaders to deny the fact that everyone is beyond the name Christian. So that's the name also is seen as an identity of unity among diversity in culture and in the way of life that people have. There's a lot of differences in terms of the culture, the way of life, the way of doing things. But only major factor that can unite them as one of them is Christian identity. And that's why this name is still brought up in a broader discussion in terms of politics, development, and all other aspects in Papua New Guinea. So the report covers a lot more things, but I'll also allow my colleague Jim to come in, because I don't want to talk too much on that. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, William. Much appreciated. Jim, let's bring you in here. So one of the developments that's happened since your report came out um, was this change to the Constitution, explicitly invoking the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. I'd love to get your take on what that change tells us about the status of religion, particularly Christianity, in Papua New Guinea today.
Thank you, Judd, and thank you, William, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to our work. So shortly after we did the report in March 2024, there were two constitutional amendments passed by the Papua New Guinea Parliament. One on changing the rules around the votes of no confidence, and the second one on Papua New Guinea's identity as a Christian nation. I think at the political level, both of these amendments passed with overwhelming majorities. In the case of the religion amendment, it was 80 in favour, 4 against. And it shows the sort of, this is something the Prime Minister, James Marape, was putting forward, and it shows his political dominance and his control over the Parliament. Prime Minister Marape said he was happy with the amendments because they recognise that Papua New Guinea's identity as a Christian country and the role that churches have played in the development of the country, particularly many of the sort of social sectors like health, education, and even infrastructure and transport. But the most notable critic of this amendment was actually the Catholic Bishops' Conference of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And Catholics make up about 30% of the population of Papua New Guinea. And it's sort of their concern was that this new amendment would contradict or sections that were already in the Constitution that protected an individual's right to practice any religion or none at all. And the Papua New Guinea Constitution in 1975, which comes after sort of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, is sort of has some very strong rights like this one. And one of the concerns that they had was that it would contradict the Universal Declaration, and that one of the MPs who spoke to this, the East Sepik Province Governor and National MP Alan Bird, considered that given the protections that already existed in the Constitution, that the amendment was unnecessary and divisive. That there is worries that this could lead to some sort of one denomination being favoured over another. There is worries about it could be used in a coercive way and limit the rights of people to have public and private associations. And I think there's worries ultimately that what it might mean for education or other policies such as health, and on the international sphere, concerns that it may affect Papua New Guinea's relations with other countries around the world and in the region, including with its neighbour Indonesia, which very deliberately, while it is a Muslim majority nation, has a very much a secular approach to the government to recognise that it has a number of minorities, including Christian minorities, within its borders. So I think that there's still a lot to know how this will play out, but I think there is, at that higher level, some concerns that it was unnecessary and possibly will complicate governance and international relations in the future.
Thank you, Jim. Much appreciated. I want to go back to William, and then I'll want to bring Miranda in. So, William, the second half of your report for USIP focuses in on this issue of sorcery accusation-related violence. And here again, probably some folks on the call who are very familiar with this topic, others for whom they're totally unfamiliar and kind of shocked that there's sorcery accusation-related violence. So, I wonder if you could just, again, orient us to that issue. What exactly is it, and why has it become so prevalent in Papua New Guinea?
Yeah, thank you. When we look at the issue of sorcery accusation-related violence, it really tapped into people's way of life, the way of thinking, and the way of doing things. Because when we look at the people, they are more oriented into believing in some sort of supernatural powers in their cultural background. And when in Papua New Guinea, when you look at the inland and the upper highlands, most of these beliefs are not part of their life, have not been part of their custom. But when you look at the lower parts of the country, the lower land, this belief in sorcery and practice of witchcraft has somehow been part of their life. But what we see really changing now is the dynamics of violence that is superseding the belief, and even torturing and the level of violence that is inflicted in the accused it's something that is really a modern phenomenon. And when we look at that accusation, that sort of like belief from the coastal passing up to the highlands, and when in places where sorcery belief is a custom, they also have another counter belief or a way of taking revenge or doing another sorcery to counterattack the sorcerers. But in parts of the highlands and in many other parts where they do not have those practice, when they hear those narratives, they started resolving into violence as they used to in the past, especially in my place in Enga and the other parts of Ella. When we have a conflict or problem, we resolve through fighting, and whoever wins, that resolves the problem. So this kind of narratives, when it comes to our societies, or in societies like that, and when people don't know how to address it, they address it in a way they're quite common, or way they're used to. And that's also sort of like spreading that sort of violence to other places. And people are thinking that that's the right way to address it. And the other common factor that is also taking on from there is the literacy level of the people that could not really explain the kind of sickness or the causes of problems that are arising in the communities. And that's when they quickly attach or quickly align their thinking into something supernatural must have been behind their failure in business or schools or employment or any other things. Even a vehicle can be, the engines can be cut off, but people will still relate to sorcery because they don't know exactly what's happening. So lack of understanding and lack of knowledge and education is also contributing towards the spread of this violence across the mainland of Papua New Guinea. And people in the coastal, when we have more people living together in a mixed culture, where the cultural norms are still not passing through, they see what's happening in the islands, and then they are borrowing this violence in the coastal areas. And now what's happening in the islands is happening in the coast. So there is this shift of violence moving from the islands down to the coast. And there is this level of accusation increasing in the highlands where it used to be in the coast. So these are some of the changes that we just picked up. And I think Miranda will give us some more insights on that. So maybe I'll stop there for now. Thank you.
Well, that's very helpful, William. Yeah, Miranda, you have written on this issue extensively, as well as issues of intertribal violence and violence against women. How does the sorcery issue fit into that broader picture?
Yeah, I think as William says, it's a really complex ecology where we've got different factors feeding into other factors. And as he points out, there's a normalization of violence across all of these different dimensions that is that's very, very troubling, actually. We're just seeing extremely high levels of violence against women and girls, and also high levels of intergroup violence as well. There's a number of different aspects, I suppose, but I would like to say that it's not just in Papua New Guinea that we have sorcery accusation related violence. So it is something that is prominent across many parts of the world, sub-Saharan Africa, India. There are cases in the United Kingdom, cases in the US as well. So it's not just something that should be thought of as, Papua New Guinean. But in relation to what is the connection between intergroup fighting and sorcery accusations, sometimes sorcery accusations trigger intergroup fighting. Sometimes you've got a sorcery accusation that leads to displacement of entire communities, and that makes people a lot more vulnerable to, again, inter-ethnic conflict, but also women are much more vulnerable when they are living not on their own community, so they're vulnerable to other forms of sexual violence. Another factor that is arising that we're seeing is these cases. So generally, sorcery accusation related violence, or SARV, we call it, occurs it's a form of collective violence. So you'll have 20, 30, 50 people who are all involved, and it happens outside in a public place. And people are now filming this and then uploading it onto social media, onto WhatsApp messages, and then that is circulating. And so again, we, this is the kind of the circulation of these behavioral scripts across the country that seem to lead to it spreading. And one dimension of that also seems to be quite a recent phenomenon is that there's quite a sexualized element to this violence. So although both men and women can be victims of SARV, it is in many parts of the highlands predominantly women, and women are tortured in ways that involve attacking their genitals. They have it's very, very, very violent, and these kind of violations are often filmed, and then again that is circulated. So this is a particularly, I suppose, genderized form of violence as well, and in the way in which it's playing out, particularly at the moment. I think that I might hand back to you then, Judd. Has that answered your question?
Yeah, that's helpful. And I have a follow-up for you and perhaps others, and that is the role of religion in all of this. I mean, it would seem to be that religion is at least implicitly involved in the issue and exacerbating the problem. Though I'm also curious what you can tell us about how religious groups are fighting back against this problem.
Yep, so I would say that there are two dimensions to it. So one of the big catalysts of sorcery accusations and the related violence in PNG are what we call glass man or glass Mary, sort of diviners, and then also prayer warriors who come out of the Christian tradition. So you've got both these customary figures and then also religious figures who both tend to catalyze the violence by confirming, yes, this person, this accused person has used sorcery, or yes, this person who's sick is sick because of some supernatural element. And again, the involvement of pastors in this particular space is something that's very common across the world, and it's often being commercialized. So people will pay large amounts of money to these glass man, glass Mary, or prayer warriors in order for their assistance to deal with particular problems where they think sorcery is involved. We've heard of glass man and glass Mary who will go from funeral to funeral and then offering their services, for example. But some you can just call on a mobile phone and get their advice. But on the other hand, there are also a lot of churches that are really actively trying to prevent and to care for the victims of SARV. The Catholic Church, particularly up in the Highlands, they've been doing a lot of work for many years, doing advocacy and awareness, doing marches, and going and intervening as well. When there is a particular case, then people will often call, the bishop to organize a rescue, and they will send in teams who will do negotiation, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not successful. A recent example as well of a positive use of Christianity to address the problem has been the development of a community curriculum by a colleague of mine, Anton Lutz. And he's really taken a lot of scriptural principles and put those into a very detailed curriculum that leads community members through thinking about, accusations of sorcery, what that means, and really makes them aware that this is a false belief, and that these kind of false beliefs cause a lot of problems in their communities. That curriculum has been piloted for the first time, and really successful results are starting to come through about how the impact that that's had in terms of changing people's mindset, making them a lot more skeptical that if something has gone wrong, then that sorcery is the cause of it, and then also giving them the skills to advocate and try to stop people from taking violent steps towards those that they're accusing.
Thank you, Miranda. William, anything you'd want to add by way of the religious element in fueling or combating the problem?
Just one point about combating the problem. I think the religious figures are in a better position, meaning to say that they have that connection, they have that network, and they are well respected in the communities. When people and police and other leaders intervene during a violence, the perpetrators don't respond. They just send them away. But when a religious figure like a bishop or a priest, when they intervene to rescue the survivor, they sometimes release the victim or the survivor to the hands of the pastors or the church leaders. And that's been a scenario where they have that connection and network that makes it easier for them to really talk to the perpetrators, as well as giving shelter and rescuing those survivors. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'd like to broaden our geographic scope a bit. We can obviously come back to Papua New Guinea, but Miranda, you mentioned earlier that you've done research on this topic globally, and as well as in other countries in Melanesia. I'm curious what you found in places like Vanuatu and the Solomon Islands, how those religion and violence there interact in ways that are perhaps similar or different from Papua New Guinea.
Yeah, so there are sorcery accusations that occur in Solomon Islands and in Vanuatu, and they do lead to violence, to deaths and to burning of houses, for example. But that will just be maybe 1 or 2 cases a year, whereas in Papua New Guinea, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of cases a year. So there's a really big difference in terms of the scope. And also, in Vanuatu and in Solomon Islands, when this does occur, then the police are generally onto it. There are prosecutions that happen. There's, a big storm about it in the media. Whereas in Papua New Guinea, there is often just impunity for those who carry out these crimes, unfortunately. In general, in terms of how is both of those countries, Solomon Islands and Vanuatu, are also very Christian countries, and those who are working to combat violence are really trying to think about how they can use Christian principles to combat violence, because sometimes, for example, Christian principles are used to justify violence against women. And so a lot of theologians are thinking, well, actually, no, we think that these are misunderstandings of the Bible, and they're developing curriculums such as something called the theology of gender equality, which is really trying to reinterpret scripture in a way that that shows that there should be respectful and non-violent treatment of women. I've seen one of those programs operating very successfully. It was called Men Be the Change in Vanuatu. It was a World Vision program, and really, rather than using the language of human rights, these curriculums use the language of the Bible, and it works surprisingly well. But you think it's surprising, but then when you remember, actually, that's the way that people have learned since they were, since they were babies in their mother's arms. They were going to church. They were thinking about morality through the scripture. And so, of course, it actually is a lot less of a foreign way of thinking about it than human rights discourses.
Thanks, Miranda. Gordon, I have a couple of specific questions for you related to the current Pope and the previous Pope in regards to the region, but wondered if you or Jim had any other comments on religion and violence in the broader Oceania region that you'd want to offer here. Jim or Gordon?
No, I can speak a little bit to that. Thank you, Judd, for the invitation, and it's a great pleasure to be on this for a number of reasons. It's a great pleasure to share a stage with Jim and Miranda and William, whose work I admire tremendously. And I would really encourage all who are on the call to look up Miranda and William's work. They've developed websites on this, and it is brave, unsung, important, funded by the smell of an oily rag work, and it's really unheralded work, and I really commend them for it. And we put a little bit of that into the report that Jim and Miranda did. It's also really nice to see some of my former USIP colleagues online as well, and I give credit to you, Judd, for having sort of resurrected this report from sort of purgatory or limbo that it was in as well. I just want to add something to what Miranda and William said, which is the tension that there is in the Pacific between the sacred and the secular. And often I think we want to kind of focus on sort of the secular thing, the human rights, the language that Miranda spoke about. But yet in my travels in the Pacific, I've seen the value of using sacred language, for want of a better term, in order to try to dampen down violence. I'm a cradle Catholic, and I know just how much the words of the Bible can be used. There can be a kind of a domineering, quite vindictive God, but there can also be a kind of social justice God as well. And it's really remarkable, as Miranda said, how religion can be used to exacerbate, but in many places in the Pacific, it can also be used as a dampening agent, as a way by which you can have difficult conversations. Miranda cites the work that was done in Vanuatu. I've seen that work also go on in Solomon Islands and elsewhere in the Pacific, where there's a limit to this very human rights, secular, gender equality language, but actually once language that is more kind of religiously attuned comes out, then you can see it working much better. Just to pivot back to Papua New Guinea for a bit, we were fortunate enough to support Miranda and William's work at USIP. One of the most difficult conversations I've had to have this year was to tell people like William that our funding had to stop because of the aid cuts that there were. But we also had a really terrific program that I'm delighted to say has been picked up by the government of Australia, and which are running it, which talks about men's behavior change, talks about to try to address these interpersonal violence elements that there are in Papua New Guinea, which has the second highest rate of interpersonal violence in the world, and many other Pacific countries are not too far behind it in that grim statistic. And there, our colleagues, our USIP colleagues there, were using strategies and techniques in order to try to sort of divert young men away from a path of kind of everyday violence that they were clearly falling down into. And a lot of the language that was used in those training programs that we developed were infused by religion. They were infused by kind of religious principles. If anyone is interested, we commissioned a report on this, an evaluation report, which we were hoping to use as the kind of launching pad for a wider funding round. But it was really interesting how the evaluator discovered that this was one of the factors that was behind which made this program a success. And I think something for the strategists for the hub that you're in, Judd, is to think about from a kind of Pacific lens how much that language of religion kind of reaches parts that more standard language, standard sort of human rights, sort of international development language doesn't reach as amenably or as ably. I was in the Cook Islands a couple of months ago. Again, a similar story where churches were able to be the sort of binding agent in a way for society that maybe certain parts of the government was not. So it's a really interesting research topic. It's something that I think there's a lot more to explore on, and I commend you and my fellow or the authors for having written the report.
Well, thank you so much, Gordon. Good word. Jim, you've been focused on the region for a long time. Just curious if you have any other insights you'd want to share before I ask Gordon some Pope-related questions.
Thanks, Judd. I would just reinforce the point that Miranda has made, and I think Gordon alluded to, that across Pacific, the churches are very important in institutions in addressing violence against women, and we see that in a number of countries. But I would sort of segue to sort of talk about some of my experience working in Bougainville, which is an autonomous region of Papua New Guinea, for those who don't know it. And geographically, it's sort of part of the Solomon Islands archipelago, and it was known as the North Solomons Province some time back. And I think there I worked a lot with community government, and it's very unique in one way, is that there are equal numbers of men and women in community government, and the chairs of community governments rotate between men and women. And so currently 45 of the 47 chairs are women. And when you look at those women and you talk to know, and you get to know them and get to know the really, what I think in another context, Gordon, one of your team is called the efficacious personalities. That when you come across very organized community governments, which play an important role in mediating or moderating and managing community conflict of all sorts, you find those women are wearing multiple hats. They're often head of the parish council. They're often head of the school board, which is a religious school. And they've often gone to the same schools, and they are networked through the churches. And I think that there's a sort of an underlying role that religion is playing in preparing leaders who will perform functions to sort of manage conflict in their communities and to manage their communities in general. So, you know, I think I remember one particular a meeting I had to have a meeting at 7 o'clock in the morning, because the community government chair was just so busy with parish work, with school work. She was wearing 4 or 5 different hats and running around and celebrating the 100th anniversary. I think it was the Maris priests coming to Bougainville. So religion is very much entwined with all forms of governance and governance in the region, and that's just one example where in Bougainville, which it all comes together and plays a very positive strengthening role in mitigating and managing community level conflict. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Jim. Let me just remind the audience, if you have a question, you can click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen and type it there. Please be brief, and also let us know if you have a specific panelist that you want to address your question to. See, there's one already in there, and hope to see a few more there within the next few minutes. But Gordon, a question for you. When we first met last September, the Pope Francis was in the region. He visited Papua New Guinea, and you offered some commentary at the time in your own writing and some interviews. I'm curious, a year later, what sort of lasting impact was there from that visit and the interventions that the Pope made at the time?
Well, I mean, the last major trip that the Pope made before his passing was this sort of giant swing through Asia. He began in Singapore. He went to Papua New Guinea, and he went to Port Moresby, the capital, where he presided over a large mass in the capital. And then he went up to a northern settlement, which was where sort of the brothers that I can't remember the family that he comes from, but the religious family that he from in Argentina had an outpost there as well. So we went to visit that, which I think underscores the importance of kind of missionaries, the role of missionaries who are really inscribed in Papua New Guinean life, as William said, in terms of providing health services and education services where the state does not reach. So he really, I think, underscored that in his visit. And then he went to Timor-Leste, a country that I lived in, had the great pleasure of living in for 3 or 4 years. Jim knows it very well as well, where he presided over an open air mass, which had half the population of the country attending. So that's 600,000, 700,000 people attended this mass as well. So it shows that he was a man who had tremendous, pulling power for this. Now, what is the impact of it? I think it's hard to kind of put your kind of finger on the scale and say it was this and it was that. I mean, but I think his words were really quite powerful in a lot of places. So what he mentioned a lot about the role of the importance of trying to stop gender-based violence. He mentioned sorcery, accusation related violence in his address in Port Moresby. When he went to Dili, he mentioned a major problem that is brewing in that country, which is a place where 70% of the population are under the age of 20 and do not have jobs and do not have prospects of getting them. There's a huge employment crisis in Timor-Leste as well. And it's hard to know the impact of it, but I will afford you one story just to close off. And I'm so grateful for colleagues who put questions into the chat. I used to do facilitation for USIP, and at this point you were always worried whether there were going to be questions coming or not. So there's a very meaty question in the chat, which is I was at an event on Monday night with an East Timorese minister and 4 or 5 members of parliament that were visiting Canberra, where I live now. And each and every one of them, in their own different way, referenced the Pope's visit and what the Pope had said to them. Now, that really struck me. It struck me for the purpose of this conversation because it made me think that it was quiet, private conversations. And we've all had quiet, private conversations with people that we admire who have changed or altered our behavior. And it was really striking that a year on, they referenced their conversations with the Pope, who was talking about his concerns for the country. And when they mentioned it, they didn't mention the strategic development plan. They didn't mention the latest development initiative that Australia was working on. They all mentioned the conversations they had with Pope Francis. Pope Leo, I think, is someone who is newer to this part of the Pacific, but of course, I mean, a lot of his ministry took place on the east side of the Pacific in Latin America. But I think this whole conversation has just really reinforced for me, and hopefully reinforced for listeners tuning in, about how really the sacred is very important in Asia and the Pacific, and it would behoove us to remember that whenever we're thinking about either programming work or thinking about kind of the geopolitics work that is really obvious and pregnant in the region as well. So I'll hand it back to you, Judd.
Thanks, Gordon. All right, I've got a follow-up question for you, Gordon, but let me go to our first question. Hopefully not our only question, but so if you do have a question that you wanting to pose to our panelists, please do type it up and send it to us. But let's go to this first one. It builds on some of the things that particularly William and Miranda said. So the questioner says, I've worked in Papua New Guinea since 1998 in and around Wau. In the cases that I've witnessed and discussed with folks there, violence was initially associated with certain smaller churches and their members, but it is increasing across different churches in recent years. What role do different churches play in the spread of violence, and how do these mitigation efforts speak to members of more than these, at times, very different versions of Christianity? Particularly William and Miranda, if you want to tackle it. Miranda, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in, and then William come in afterwards. So I think it's very true that there has been this proliferation of different churches. Before, there was just, you had one particular denomination in one village, and there was a sense of solidarity that gave. And now more and more new churches are coming in, and they're creating competition for congregation members, for the tithes that are paid. And so churches need to make themselves more exciting in order to get more members. And they're doing that in ways that, you know, involve music, great, but also this kind of preaching that really emphasizes on evil spirits and devils and the need for exorcism and all of those kind of dimensions to this preaching are very much driving the sorts of accusations that we're seeing and the sorts of quite violent responses. And again, I stress that this is happening in Papua New Guinea, but also in very many parts of the world. So it's that commercialization, if you like, of Christianity that is creating a lot of problems. But to counter that, and to pick up on something that Jim said, I think it's also really important to realize that many of the people who set themselves up to care for survivors, who go and who advocate, who put their own lives at risk in order to rescue people who are in the midst of being literally burnt to death by a mob. When you speak with them and you say, what is it that is motivating you to do that? Then overwhelmingly they say it's because, you know, of God, that it is their Christian faith that is driving them to, you know, be putting themselves and sometimes their own families' lives at risk. So, you know, we've just got both of these things going on all of the time. And then finally, there have been attempts to have a whole, like a united Christian statement against sorcery accusation related violence, and to get all of the different denominations to sign up to this set of principles to say we're going to oppose that. And a statement was put out a couple of years ago, and I believe that it is going to be reinvigorated. And the Melanesian Institute that are based up in Goroka have been doing some really important work in terms of trying to get that statement being used more and to bring different churches together to make unified statements, because there is no doubt that that is something that absolutely needs to happen. And so I'll kick to William to expand on that further.
Thank you, Miranda. I think most of the things Miranda said regarding one of the things that also contributing to violence from the church's perspective is the new denominations are interpreting the Bible from their own understanding and trying to fit their own teachings and trying to convince the people to attract them. And that's when they are mistaken by sometimes provoking violence. For example, the wives have to submit to their husbands. So that's when, I mean, this kind of expression, so sentences in the Bible, they interpret it at their own understanding. And that's when it comes to contradict some of those cultural values and norms that we have. And some of these denominations started condemning some of these cultural practices like traditional attires, those compensation things, marriage ceremonies. They're condemning this. And other churches are promoting that. So there's sort of like people are pulled in between the two type of teachings. And that's when they sort of like lose in the focus of what is actually the value of Christianity. And that's why I would also agree with Miranda to say that, I mean, there's a unified teaching would be really helpful to see who's teaching what and what are the elements in the church or in a particular denomination that's provoking violence or it's promoting violence. So those can be really addressed. And one of those bodies in place, like the churches, the Council of Churches, it's comprised of a number of churches. And this kind of voices are really helpful to help other churches to really get them on focus so that they can avoid violence or promote violence in the communities.
Well, thank you, Miranda. And William, just to add to that conversation, a question from Pawasha Kakar, who is the director of the religion team at USIP. Nice to have you on the call, Pawasha. She asks, are there signs that the constitutional changes that Jim in particular talked about earlier, Are there signs that those constitutional changes will limit the ability of indigenous religious practices and beliefs by privileging Christianity, I suppose, over indigenous traditions? William, Miranda, or others?
I can maybe have a crack at that. Which is it's a good question. One of the things that's sort of always fascinated me about Papua New Guinea is the importance that is ascribed to having a constitutional amendment or having a law or having a regulation or having a policy. And a lot of effort is often put in to that. The challenge is always that these things are put up and then very, very difficult to either be implemented, or everyone's so busy working on the next law or the next policy that they forget about things. And that is often a bad thing. So, I mean, Miranda and William can speak more extensively than me to the laws that are in place against domestic violence, against intergroup fighting, that are very thinly implemented. And I would imagine this constitutional amendment will probably have the same fate, which is PNG government has a implementation challenge. Sometimes that's bad, but sometimes it can be a sort of blessing in disguise in terms of the weakness of the state. I think it's very unlikely that it would have that'll have a particular effect on this. Sadly, there are too many laws and statutes on the books that are not followed. This may be a case where a law or a statute or an amendment on the books may not be followed, and that may not be a bad thing, because I think as we write in the report, religion and kind of quote unquote, indigenous beliefs are metabolized and mixed together in the same stew in a lot of ways. So it would be very difficult, I think, to separate them out. Over.
A question from Erin Felton that dovetails nicely with what you were just saying, Gordon. She asked, could you talk a bit about the government's response, presumably to the sort of violence we're talking about, understanding its limited capacity, especially at the local levels, and the impact it has or hasn't had?
I can talk to that. So the government back in 2015 enacted a national action plan to address sorcery accusation related violence, and that set out a very holistic response that said, we need to think about justice, but we also need to think about health, we need to think about education, we need to think about care and counseling. A lot of the elements of that plan were not actually implemented in practice. I would say that the vast majority of resources and emphasis has gone really on has gone on response, has gone into, training of village court magistrates, training of police officers, attempts to do prosecution. But as the question implies, they have had, unfortunately, very, very limited impact on halting this violence at a local level. An example, we had a horrific case in Hela about a month ago where a woman was tortured for over 2 days. Images of it were circulated around WhatsApp groups, and yet, she wasn't rescued. There was a police station that was not that far away, but they didn't have the resources to be able to go and to rescue her. She ended up being shot and pushed into a river in front of the entire community. There was then a big outrage, and 8 perpetrators were in fact arrested. Great news, but then 2 weeks later they were released because they hadn't been charged. There hadn't been the necessary investigations and follow through to enable that process to occur. So we're constantly seeing this kind of failure of the criminal justice system to bring perpetrators to account, and we are also yet to see a really sort of stepping up in terms of SARV awareness getting part of the education curriculum in terms of health workers being able to really explain causes of death in ways that don't trigger accusations of sorcery. I'm hoping that there is a renewed emphasis at the moment on taking this approach. There's been a revised SARV National Action Plan, which was just launched last week, which again has this holistic vision and shows that there needs to be many different parts of the government, right from the national government through to provincial and district levels, need to all be working together in order to address it.
And a question that builds on that nicely, Miranda, I think earlier you mentioned statements and resources developed by religious groups to address the issue. A questioner asks, to what extent does the current education curriculum in PNG integrate Indigenous knowledge, spirituality, and Christian teachings in a way that addresses or avoids violence?
I might pass to William to see if you've got thoughts on that, William.
And I'll just note, we just have a couple minutes left and we'll need to wrap up.
Sorry, is the question up again?
You're on mute.
Yep. Asking about the current educational system in PNG and whether it incorporates Indigenous knowledge or Christian teachings in ways that helps to avoid violence down the road.
I think I'm not really sure, but at the moment we are still trying to change from one curriculum to the other, and then the education system is not really supportive at the moment as we see. But going forward, there's an element of bringing in those cultural aspects that are very helpful in terms of saving the moral behavior of the kids, in terms of passing on the social values. Because when we look at the current situation in PNG, there's a lot of breakdown in the moral upbringing of the child when they pass through education systems. And that's sort of like a focus that it really has to be integrated at the primary level when they go up to the secondary. And then that's one of those widely discussed agenda at the moment. And hopefully they will bring in some of these things. But at the moment, I haven't seen any education plan that is really trying to look into that sort of idea as to incorporate into the education system. And I cannot speak more. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Well, that brings us just about to the end of our time together. Thank you to our panelists for offering such important, interesting insights with our audience today on a topic that obviously is very sobering. And Miranda, you especially have added details that underscore just how tragic and sobering this is. A problem that's obviously not unique to Papua New Guinea. There's elements of religion and violence in lots of places around the world, and our discussion today has reminded us of what we often call the ambivalence of religion, that religious ideas and images and institutions can be used to fuel really awful things like sorcery, accusation-related violence, but also those same ideas, images, institutions can be used in constructive, peaceful ways to combat this kind of violence we've talked about today. So thank you for walking us through this case study in Papua New Guinea and broader Melanesia. Thanks to our audience for being with us and for asking several good questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them, but I appreciate you posing those questions. Also thanks to my Berkley Center colleagues at Georgetown for helping to put this event together. Thank you all, and look forward to seeing you on future Berkley Center events. So long.
Thank you. Bye-bye.